The students gathered in the school hallway, eyes glued to the honor roll list. They were all impressed by a name that appeared at the top every time: Huju. Huju, an 18-year-old third-year high school student, had a reputation for always taking first place. Walking past the crowd, he glanced over at the list but showed little interest in other people's rankings. Instead, he was far more into literature, video games, and protein powder. What he didn't enjoy, however, was a certain girl at school. As he continued down the hall, he saw her sprinting toward him, hand outstretched as if to grab him by the neck. She yelled, frustrated, asking how he kept scoring higher than her without even studying. With a calm tone, he suggested she simply memorize the textbooks by reading through them, just like he did. "It works fine for me," he shrugged, but she looked unconvinced. It was clear she found his method of memorization impossible to believe. This is Sakawa Moore, a college student. He doesn't mind his own looks. After all, he's as handsome as any professional model. What gets on his nerves, though, is her constant shouting over minor things, picking fights, and arguing with him. He's completely fed up with her antics. One day, his friend him tries to calm him down, suggesting he not go overboard, or else SED will start crying and wonder why he keeps fighting with her. Amor pauses, pulling a face before saying he doesn't even have a reason for it. Honestly, he just wants to punch SED in the face every time he sees her. SED, overhearing, feels so annoyed by this that she almost acts on it instinctively. At that moment, her cousin Shai arrives, carrying a book, and asks if she's fighting with her brother again. Saidi insists it's not a fight, she's just being attacked. Shai walks over and pats her on the head to comfort her, offering a bit of reassurance amidst the chaos. Asks Sakawa if he's paying attention to Est because he's interested in her. Offended, Sakawa snaps back that even if Est were the last person on Earth, he still wouldn't go near her. Not one to back down, Saidi raises her voice, saying she feels the exact same way. She wouldn't go with him either. Their heated exchange begins to draw a few curious looks from passersby. Later, just as Sakawa finally heads home, his phone rings. It's his grandfather inviting him over for tea and a chat. Sakawa declines, saying he has a book to read, but his grandfather insists, reminding him that with his future role in the company, he should make time. Even so, SAD is stubborn and refuses to come. His grandfather's tone turns serious, telling him that if he were as clever as he thought, he'd understand that a direct request from his grandfather isn't something to ignore. As notices a luxury car parked outside his school, and a few men step out with chains in hand, clearly there to escort SED. Reluctantly, SED agrees to get in and sits inside the car. The driver and other attendants apologize to him, explaining that today the head of the family was insistent. They reassure him, reminding him that he's well loved in the family and is seen as the one destined to lead the company, unlike his father. Decades ago, when the Huju Group faced a major recession and nearly collapsed, SED's grandfather, Shinryo, worked tirelessly to save it. Thanks to his efforts, Huju Group was reborn as one of Japan's top companies. Now, even at over 60 years old, his mind remains as sharp as ever. Sachu arrives at a traditional restaurant, steps inside, and spots Kaling, who looks just as surprised. Kaling remarks sarcastically about the terrible coincidence of running into him while trying to enjoy a meal with his grandmother. Satu, nose buried in a book, agrees with the sentiment. A, however, can't resist and snaps at him, accusing him of just trying to grab attention. Their exchange quickly turns into a full-blown argument, each one glaring at the other with obvious irritation. Moments later, SED's grandfather and A's grandmother arrive, urging them to hurry up and asking how long they plan on standing around. SED and A, unsure if the elders are really talking to them, follow inside. The group settles into a cozy cabin, where SED's grandfather and A's grandmother share a toast, while SED and A are served glasses of orange juice. Escaping wasn't really an option for Sed, with guards standing right behind the gate. He turns to Sakawa and asks why he's been sipping on juice since they got there. Sakawa replies, saying he was hungry but lost his appetite. Sed chuckles, admitting he feels a similar tightness in his stomach, thanks to Sakawa's presence. With forced smiles, they joke about ending each other's lives, masking the tension between them. Just then, Sed's grandfather steps in, commenting on how close the two seem to be. This catches them off guard, and they have no idea what he means. Sed finally asks his grandfather why he brought them both here in the first place. Calmly, the grandfather drops a bombshell. He wants them to get married. Se and Sakawa are stunned, struggling to process what they just heard. tries to clarify, wondering if he misunderstood, but his grandfather assures him he heard exactly right. Tries to reason with his grandmother, pointing out that they're still high school students, way too young to be thinking about marriage. His grandmother responds that, technically, they're old enough to marry once they turn 18. Then, Said's grandfather steps in, sharing a story from his youth with Chio, A's grandmother. He tells them how he and Chio had been in love when they were young but never expressed it openly. Instead, he married Insuk, who brought him happiness until her passing 10 years ago. Chio's husband has also since passed, and now she's cared for by Tenri. Both have had fulfilling lives, but they often wonder if things might have been even better if they'd been together from the start. That's why they want their grandchildren to understand and explore their own feelings, ones they themselves could never fully experience. Chio, with a slightly threatening tone, asks Akan if he'd consider marriage just for her sake. Akan quickly rejects the idea, explaining that marriage should be about finding the right person he truly loves, being romantically proposed to, and marrying by choice. Said chimes in, also refusing, saying that in Japan, it's uncommon to force someone into marriage against their will. The grandparents laugh, clearly anticipating this reaction. Tenri remarks that their responses remind him of his own younger days. Then, jokingly, he suggests bringing in a dog as the successor if Sadhu isn't willing. He tells them he's even picked a dog specifically for the job, a clever one that can sign documents by stamping ink on its paw and leaving an official print. Seda raises a concern, saying a non-human could never legally make a contract, which leads Tenri to agree that if things ever got to that point, Hyuju Group would likely collapse after his passing. He then calls Akan over and whispers something into his ear, giving him and Said 3 days to think it over. But Akan immediately shouts, full of confidence, that it's impossible, especially a marriage with her. Meanwhile, Said, holding back, fears that his future might hold nothing but disaster if he continues down this path. Said dreams of A arguing with him, refusing marriage, and jolts awake, thinking it's the worst morning ever, having the girl he despises most appear in his dreams. He realizes why she showed up so clearly. The unsettling words of his grandfather are still haunting him. As he gets ready for school, Said's mind races with the strange thought of being matched with a lifelong partner, especially one chosen by someone else. He's determined to take over his grandfather's company, no matter the challenges, but having a prearranged marriage feels like too high a price to pay. And to top it off, that partner would be Akan. Dealing with her every day at school is annoying enough, but imagining her at home, continuing their endless arguments, that might just drive him insane. The grandfather gave them 3 days to think it over and make a final decision. On the first day back at school, Said walks into class and immediately locks eyes with A, who quickly looks away. Attempting to break the tension, Said greets her, but she turns her back on him, avoiding any interaction. Noticing the awkward exchange, Shazi teases Said, saying it's unusual for him to try talking to A and that he's been acting strange since the day before. Embarrassed, Said stammers a weak excuse, claiming Shazi is just imagining things. Later, Said spots a reading outside the classroom and tries to approach her again. This time, he asks about what Shio whispered in her ear during her conversation with the grandfather. A brushes him off, saying it's none of his business, but Said insists. He argues that if they don't figure out what their family is scheming, they'll be forced into a situation neither of them wants. A scoffs, telling him not to try to get too close, then abruptly leaves, leaving Said behind. Feeling frustrated by her stubbornness, he realizes that building any kind of cooperation with her might be harder than he thought. He was still trying to figure out a way to work with A, but Shay's piercing gaze kept bothering him. Sha, his cousin and classmate, often visited his home, so she was like family. The last thing he wanted was for Sha to get involved in this marriage mess, as that would just complicate things further. After school, he realized he'd forgotten something and returned to the classroom to grab it. Just as he entered, he overheard A talking to H. Curious. Said ducked under a desk to stay out of sight. Shazi was also hiding there, clearly also drawn in by the conversation. I was asking H what he'd do if he was forced to marry someone he didn't like. H replied confidently that no one should be forced into marriage, and if it were him, he'd reject it, especially since he already had someone he liked. This revelation caught A off guard, prompting her to ask about the person H was interested in, though he kept it a secret. H then turned the question back on A, asking if she had anyone she liked, leaving A visibly flustered. Said, hidden nearby, couldn't help but wonder what A's answer would be. I tried to think it over, but nothing seemed to fit. H, Noticing her indecision, joked that if she didn't like anyone, she should just marry anyway. At least that way they could split the cost of living. Embarrassed by the idea of arranged marriage, a flush, and both of them ended up blushing. Flustered, it quickly left the scene. Shah and Said had been listening to the whole conversation from their hiding spot. Shazi, who noticed Said's odd behavior since the day before, asked him what was going on. Said avoided telling the full truth, brushing it off by saying he wasn't worried about anything. But Shazi wasn't easily convinced. Knowing Said's habits well, she could tell something was weighing on him, especially with the way he furrowed his brow when stressed. Concerned, she pressed him further, refusing to let him go without an answer. She asked if their grandfather had asked for something unreasonable, and Said reluctantly confirmed. Shazi reminded him that if he wanted to lead Huju Group one day, he'd need to follow their grandfather's instructions. Otherwise, his position might be taken by a highly skilled dog their grandfather had jokingly threatened to make his replacement. Shazi asked Said if he wanted a life of freedom or control over the company. He admitted he wanted both, which Shazi pointed out as a bit selfish. True freedom, she said, isn't really achievable for anyone. Instead of trying to escape rules, it's wiser to use them to his advantage. Shazi knew how much his dream meant to him, and she encouraged him to rely on the resources his grandfather was offering. That's why she wouldn't stand in his way, even if his life was destined to be a challenging path. She promised she'd always be there to support him. Said thanked her for her understanding. Deep down, he knew Abe would likely reject the proposal, given her personality. But if it came down to choosing between his freedom and taking control of the company, he was prepared to make that choice. On the third day, the students received a questionnaire about their future plans. The teacher asked to meet with anyone considering changing their goals from the previous year. Hess and Annie thought deeply about their dreams as they made their way to school, only to find a car waiting to take them somewhere unexpected. They arrived at their grandparents' place, where Tendo was eager to hear their final decision. When asked, S and An both replied simultaneously. They had decided to get married. Said, a bit surprised, admitted he was sure An would refuse the offer. Blushing, S clarified that he didn't have much choice and wasn't exactly thrilled about it, but they had reached a decision. Their grandparents beamed with joy at the news. With the matter seemingly settled, S tentatively suggested handling the paperwork and having the wedding ceremony after they graduated from college. But his grandparents had other ideas. They wanted them to marry right away. They even had a surprise for them, a new home they had already bought and were excited to show off. Akan and Shu were both bewildered by the situation, while Ani blushed, realizing the reality ahead of her. She would now be living with him, despite never having fallen in love, confessed any feelings, or even gone on a single date. The thought filled her with a mix of fear and embarrassment, and trembling, she braced herself for what was to come. Ultimately, they ended up moving in together in the new house, facing an unexpected beginning to their lives together. Grandma knew just how busy her grandchildren's schedules were, so she went ahead and submitted their marriage registration forms herself. And with that, they were officially newlyweds. Leaving them to start their life together, Grandpa and Grandma stepped out, giving the two some space. Said began unpacking boxes, and once he was done, he sat down to eat lunch. Sad peeked through the door, watching him eat, clearly unsure about this whole setup. Said offered to share lunch with her, but she refused, making it clear she had no intention of acting like a typical married couple. She hurried off with her own food, still grappling with the reality of their situation. When Said later returned to their room, he found it empty. Hanny had decided she wanted her own space to sleep. Tenrusu had left strict instructions that they weren't allowed to sleep on the couch or share a bed as part of their new life together. Said couldn't shake the feeling that Grandpa might be watching them. He wouldn't put it past him to have installed sensors on the bed or even hidden cameras in every corner of the house. After finding a few suspicious objects, he threw them out, determined to reclaim some privacy. He tried to settle in for sleep, but just as he got comfortable, Akane entered the room after her shower. She climbed into bed, and the closeness was awkward for both of them, given they'd never been in such a situation before. The warmth of each other's presence was new and strange, and neither could relax. After what felt like ages, still wide awake, he broke the silence, asking why she had agreed to marry him in the first place. She avoided a direct answer, explaining that it wasn't really about personal choice, it was a responsibility they both accepted for their futures. Their marriage might be just a formality, but they had to play along convincingly to avoid raising suspicion from their grandparents. For her, this was all about following through on her dreams, and she realized Said felt the same way. They were both driven by ambition, and agreeing to this arrangement was just one more step in making those dreams a reality. The next morning, they agreed to keep their marriage a secret from everyone. But when S arrived at school, Shaz immediately picked up on something odd. He caught a whiff of a new shampoo scent coming from S and asked, suspiciously, why his shampoo smelled different and where he had stayed the night. S quickly came up with an excuse, saying that his grandfather had bought him a new shampoo. But Shaz wasn't convinced. He sensed something different, as if there was a woman's presence lingering around S. Narrowing his eyes, Shaz bluntly asked if S had gotten married. He thought it was odd how his grandfather and the others were acting, so he quickly pieced together that they knew where he was staying, and that he'd actually married Kane. His grandfather, panicked, rushed over, pleading with him not to tell anyone about the marriage, but he refused, saying marriage was a huge deal, something everyone should celebrate together. Despite his grandfather's attempts to hush him, he couldn't help but feel irritated. After all, no one had consulted him before arranging his marriage. Acting like a child, he ran off dramatically, demanding answers but getting only vague replies about how his life now belonged to someone else. During the soccer match, Seto and Ain ended up on the same team, but that didn't stop Ain from challenging him, determined not to lose. They were constantly getting in each other's way, blocking each other's kicks. Age, noticing this rivalry, joked to Sko that Seto was usually calm and composed in class, but acted like a total goofball around Kane. The game heated up as Seto positioned himself to receive the ball. Just as he declared for everyone to clear the way, he relaxed, focusing on the ball's path as it came down from the opponent's field. But Ain jumped in, reaching out to block him, and accidentally kicked Seto's leg. Seto grimaced, fighting to keep his emotions in check, knowing he'd lose his focus if he let himself get too worked up. When Seto stumbled and tried to check if Ain's chin was bruised from the clash, everyone around them misunderstood, seeing it as something else entirely. As they stood up, the two started bickering, prompting the spectators to comment, "There they go again." Curious, Seto turned to Mar, who laughed and told him the two of them argued so often that everyone now saw them as a bickering couple. Embarrassed, Ain shouted, "For the last time, we're not married." While reading at home, he suddenly heard Kane scream. Assuming it was because of a cockroach, he rushed over, only to find her horrified at the sight of stacks of packaged and canned foods. Proudly, he began explaining his setup. The top shelf was packed with vegetable juice full of vitamins, cheap and tasty instant noodles that were quick to make, and protein packs containing all the necessary nutrients. Everything he had was easy to prepare. But as Kane surveyed his meal plan, she thought he'd starve if he kept eating this way. She realized if her husband fell ill, there'd be no benefit to this marriage at all. So she decided to take matters into her own hands. Shouting at him, she declared that this wasn't cooking, this was science. She was about to show him what real cooking looked like. Kane tied on an apron and started preparing food, humming happily. Her enthusiasm was clear, and she even announced she'd show him how much better she was at cooking than Seto. But Seto, clueless about her excitement, immediately assumed she was planning to poison his food. He gave her a suspicious look, convinced she might slip something strange into his meal, waiting to catch her in the act. Kane noticed his gaze and mistook it for hunger. Smiling at her shiny new pan, she happily whipped up a dish, imagining how impressed he'd be. She thought to herself, once he tastes this, he'll realize just how amazing I am in the kitchen. This was her chance to finally outshine him, something she'd never managed to do at school. He'd see her culinary skills, admire her, and thank her with genuine appreciation. It was her perfect moment to prove her worth. But when he finally tried a dish, he was surprised. It tasted normal. Growing up, Seto had often felt like an outsider in his own family, with only his grandfather showing him any warmth. At home with his parents, he was given boxed noodles, and at his grandfather's place, they always dined out at fancy restaurants. This was the first time he'd had homemade food, carefully prepared and full of simple flavors, which made it strangely special. He told her it was normal, but in his world, this was high praise. Hearing this, she blushed, feeling proud in a way she hadn't expected. But just then, he picked up another dish, and without thinking, commented that if he didn't like it, he'd just give it to the dog. Outraged, Keen chased after him, scolding him for wasting perfectly good food. Seto defended himself, saying he hadn't actually called it bad, but admitted he hadn't called it good either. They wrestled over the plate, with Seto eventually snatching it back and eating so quickly that by the end, he hadn't left a single grain of rice. Keen watched him finish dinner with a mix of satisfaction and fury, determined to make sure he'd appreciate her cooking for what it was, or at least finish every bite. It's morning and Sayu is sound asleep. Akane tries to wake him by gently tapping his face, but half asleep, he mistakes her for Shaz. When they were kids, Shaz would often sneak into his bed and poke his face like this. Still in his dreamlike state, he grabs Akane's hand, pulling her closer, thinking she's Shaz, and mutters that she can stay and sleep beside him. Instantly, he's drawn to the scent of her, something that stirs an instinctive warmth. But Akane is mortified, her face flushing as her heart races. She snaps, demanding to know what he's doing. Startled, he finally wakes up and realizes, quite embarrassed, that it's not Shaz but Akane standing over him. However, she isn't there just to wake him up. She's on a mission to scold him. She's fed up because he left a mountain of dirty dishes in the sink. After she cooked last night, she expected him to handle the cleanup, but he casually shrugs it off, suggesting they leave the dishes until they pile up to the ceiling since they have plenty of bowls. His lifestyle is beyond absurd. He waits a month before taking out the trash, while Akane is determined to keep a clean, beautiful space. Every tiny thing, like stray soap wrappers in the bathroom or the toilet paper roll left out, drives her crazy. She's exhausted trying to live with his chaotic ways, and he just can't see what the fuss is about. The tension of two people with clashing habits stuck in the same place is starting to take its toll. To unwind, Sedu dives into a loud, action-packed zombie hunting game which quickly gets on An's nerves as she's trying to prepare her lessons. In this game, players use local specialties to fend off hordes of zombies, and the noise and intense visuals make An snap at him, demanding he turn it off. She's horrified by the gory scenes on screen and frustrated, rushes over to turn it off herself. Sedu stops her, insisting she'll ruin hours of progress. She scoffs, not understanding his progress obsession, and boasts about her success with claw machines. After all, she once won a big stuffed animal. Just as she's about to pull the plug, the doorbell rings. It's a package for Setu, from his parents. He mutters that it's probably their way of erasing any memory of him from home, a place he left behind with little attachment. Yet it holds a certain familiarity, a small comfort that still means something. Heading to the bathroom, he notices the light is on, which annoys him since she constantly scolds him for leaving lights on. Frustrated, he enters only to find An in the bathtub, eyes closed. He's struck by her beauty but quickly turns to leave, fearing her wrath if she catches him. Once outside, he wonders if she might be unwell. He recalls her looking slightly pale earlier. Concerned, he re-enters the bathroom, unable to ignore the thought that she might be in trouble. After all, even though they clash, he can't just leave her if she's in danger. To his relief, she's merely fallen asleep, though he remembers accidents where people have drowned after falling asleep in bathtubs. Carefully, he lifts her out of the tub, but she stirs awake and immediately lashes out, angry and embarrassed. He tries to explain his concern, but she's too furious to listen. Later, as she dries her hair, she reflects on how exhaustion led her to fall asleep in the bath and realizes that Setu had acted out of genuine concern. Feeling guilty for yelling without hearing him out, she heads to the bedroom, where Setu is already lying down. She hesitates, lying down beside him, wondering if she should thank him or apologize. He prompts her to speak up since he's trying to sleep, but she denies having anything to say, unable to voice her true feelings. With a mixture of irritation and embarrassment, she stays silent, letting the unspoken tension linger. At school, Ain is exhausted. She's been studying intensely, yet nothing seems to stick, and mentally, she's at her breaking point. But despite it all, she's determined to stay strong and work toward her dreams. The idea of walking away from her relationship isn't even an option for her, and it leaves her stressed, unsure how to proceed. Ammar notices her frustration and asks what's on her mind. Ain, feeling torn, asks for advice on how to connect with someone she just can't seem to get along with, and guesses she's talking about Sito, which surprises Ain, who quickly denies it. Anne, however, has always suspected there's something between them, even back in their first year. Ain insists that her struggles with Sito are purely stress-inducing. She's not interested in him romantically, and advises Ain to have an open conversation with Sito to understand where he's coming from. Building a relationship, she explains, isn't about demanding respect but showing it first. Meanwhile, Sato is out with Shazi, sipping on juice instead of having a meal. Shazi asks why he's only drinking, and he admits that constant arguments with Ain at home have taken the joy out of eating. Shazi playfully suggests that if he's thinking of divorce, she's more than willing to be there for him. But Sato brushes off the idea, insisting divorce isn't an option for him. He's made a commitment, partly because of his family obligations, and knows he has responsibilities that he can't just walk away from. Shazi advises him to make the best of things with Ain if he's serious about staying. She points out that, of course, they'll clash. They were raised with different values, tastes, and social norms. If he wants to get along with Ain, they both need to be willing to compromise. Instead of always trying to win, he should try to understand her side as well. In return for her advice, Shazi jokingly asks him to carry her like a princess, and with a sigh, he obliges while she giggles playfully. Later, when Seto arrives home, he's surprised to see Ain standing at the doorway, clearly waiting for him. Despite Shazi's advice, he starts to brush past her, but she stops him, holding onto his arm and nervously bringing up a talk about their marriage. Blushing, she explains that if they're going to be in this together, they need to find a way to live peacefully and avoid making their lives miserable. Seto, with a small nod, agrees, equally tired of the constant tension. They sit down at the table, and Seto suggests they come up with some ground rules, something simple to help them respect each other's space and reduce stress. Rules, he explains, are like common ground, helping people with different values get along. If they can agree on certain things, they'll have fewer reasons to get annoyed with each other. The first topic? Housekeeping. Ain points out that, despite being married, she's been doing all the chores from day one. They quickly get into a minor argument about it. Seto mentions he only does chores when they pile up, but Ain can't stand waiting that long. After some back and forth, Seto finally agrees to wash the dishes after each meal to avoid further conflict. They go through a few more points, laying out a list of basic rules to make things run smoothly. Finally, Ain asks if there's anything else. Seto recalls something he read about how expressing gratitude can strengthen relationships. She responds with a hopeful smile and suggests that he could start by genuinely complimenting her cooking instead of calling it just normal. After all, even a small bit of praise would make all the effort she puts in worth it, lifting the mood she had while making it. They keep working through their list of shared responsibilities, getting into the details of how they'll divide housework and set boundaries for what's off-limits. By focusing on what truly stresses them out, they're both surprised at how much they begin to understand each other. Looking back, it's almost shocking. They've spent so much time arguing and barely exchanged real opinions until now. For the first time, they go to sleep without a single argument. The next day, Sadak buys a shortcake, hoping it might be a peace offering to ease any remaining tension. He's uncertain, though, wondering if the gesture might seem awkward or even a little creepy. When he offers it to her, she's surprised and asks how he knew it was her favorite. He recalls an old essay she wrote, but she doesn't even remember writing it, which leaves him feeling embarrassed. He worries that his gesture might backfire, making her more uncomfortable around him. But then she unexpectedly smiles and thanks him, charming him into silence and even making him blush. Later that evening, she surprises him with a Western-style dinner, eager to hear his reaction. As he takes his first bite, he realizes it's genuinely delicious, and she beams at his compliment. Her smile leaves him feeling anxious, unsure of how to react. After dinner, Seto heads to the sink to wash the dishes, but she joins him, even though it's supposed to be his turn. He wonders if she has an ulterior motive, but she reassures him, explaining that it's simply easier to do it together. He thanks her for helping, and she responds with a warm smile that leaves him blushing. Curious, he asks how she became so adept at housekeeping, and she explains that her parents are always busy, so she learned to handle everything on her own from a young age, even mastering curry in first grade, which surprises him. Later, while he's reading, she brings over a movie she borrowed, suggesting they watch it together. He realizes it's her subtle way of spending time with him, so they settle in to watch. The evening ends with a gaming session, a rare moment of playful conversation instead of bickering. He's surprised to find himself actually enjoying her company. When she starts to get up to wash the dishes, Seto stops her, insisting that she relax and take a bath while he handles the cleanup. She's hesitant, worried he might try to peep, but he quickly reassures her that his previous intrusion was genuinely out of concern for her safety. Relieved, she thanks him and heads off. Later, as they settle in for the night, he notices she's left partly uncovered and gently drapes the blanket over her, thinking she's already asleep, but she's awake, watching him silently. As he lies down, he casually mentions that next time, he'll pick a game or movie she actually likes. He addresses her simply as you, which she quickly corrects, admitting she'd prefer he use her first name, Akan. They exchange first names for the first time, and with a newfound sense of comfort, fall asleep. The following morning, Ane's friend Em asks if she's managed to resolve things with the person she was struggling with. Ane gratefully admits that, thanks to Am's advice, she managed to talk things through, even though it took a lot of effort. Just then, someone calls for Am from another classroom, and she leaves. Akan notices an eraser has fallen from Sito's desk while he's napping. She picks it up and gently wakes him, handing it back. He thanks her with a soft smile, and she suddenly feels her heart race. She can't help but feel conflicted. She knows she's supposed to dislike him, yet there's something else growing within her. As Akan begins to realize her shifting feelings for Sito, Am watches from a distance, determined not to give up on Sito if Akan remains unsure.